What's going on, guys? I'm Dan Weichart, VP and co-founder of the Badass Patriot Company, here today to hit into our next series, or the next in our series on the core principles of the Badass Patriot Company, namely liberty. But before we dive too deep into that, if you haven't already, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're following us on Rebel, if you happen to see this on YouTube sometime in the future, please drop us a like, hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, give us a comment, and the most important thing you can do, no matter what platform you happen to be viewing this on, share the content. And not just for selfish reasons, by all means, I absolutely want to have our content out there, but at the end of the day, our goal at the Badass Patriot Company is to bring people together. Our goal is, I'm conservative, staunchly so, but I understand that there are center and center-left individuals whom probably have a lot more in common with me than they do the radical left, which is unfortunately running the country right now, or especially running the Democratic National Convention, if not, the main, components of power within the country. Anyway, so please share this content. We're trying to bring people together. Without further ado, like I mentioned, previously we had discussed what it means to be true, or what is truth. Today, we're going to touch on liberty. Now, as a bit of disclaimer, so first off, I'm going to be referencing some notes because liberty is one of those things that I think is an often misunderstood topic, but I definitely want to get into it and really make sure that I nail down. I don't miss anything, because sometimes this can be one of those that's a little difficult to fully wrap your head around. So if you see me looking down, it's because I'm referencing notes on this, because I do think it's actually that important to make sure that's those are referenced. At any rate, so first and foremost, liberty should be properly understood in conjunction with duty. If you are familiar with our previous installments, the core principles of the Badass Patriot Company are truth, liberty, duty, and hope. And so truth kind of stands on its own. Hope, when we get down to it, will stand on its own. But liberty and duty are inextricably linked. And the reason for this, and I think I will defer to the famous podcaster, author, and warrior Jocko Willink, who many of you may be familiar with. If you haven't already, by all means, check out both his book, Extreme Ownership, along with his podcast. I think it's just the Jocko Willink podcast. Great content. But Jocko Willink coined this phrase that discipline equals freedom. The basic principle of that is essentially that even though it sounds counterintuitive, the idea is that the more discipline you exert over yourself, the more freedom you will naturally experience. Another way of phrasing this that I've heard previously, and forgive me, I don't know exactly who to attribute this to. It's just something that's been said to me so often. I don't really have a good source for it, to be honest with you. It's just many people have said it. Is that if you do not discipline yourself, then someone else will discipline you. So there's you either have the choice of self-discipline or to be under the boot of somebody else. And if you doubt that, you need only look around. If you feel that most people that are in a regular job sort of employment environment, they are being disciplined by their employer, by their boss. If you're in the self-employed realm, you have to exercise self-discipline to do that. So there's no choice, is that you must be disciplined, at least if you want success and happiness and, the good things that come out of life. Surely, I suppose you could be an undisciplined slob and, kind of sit in your house all day and only play video games. I'm not down on video games. I love playing video games. But it's one of those things where you should definitely discipline yourself if you want to get ahead in life, generally speaking. So, but like I said, Jocko Willink phrased this as discipline equals freedom. Now, this sounds somewhat counterintuitive, but that counterintuitiveness dissipates rather quickly once we examine the reality of liberty as it is tied to duty. You must understand that liberty is inextricably linked to duty, the idea of disciplining yourself, the idea of adhering to the obligations that you have in your life. Now, like I said, that counterintuitiveness dissipates rather quickly. Let me give you the easiest example that I can think of. If you are self-disciplined about your eating habits, your diet, and your exercise, you're obviously at more liberty to interact with the world as you see fit. In the sense that if you go the other direction and you're not disciplined with your diet, you don't exercise, you are limited in your ability to interact with the world. An easy example is if you have a desire to, it'd be really cool to climb a cliff face and see the top of the mountain. Well, you can't do that if you're 400 pounds overweight. As an easy example. Another great example of the discipline equals freedom component is what I've called what I've heard called, at least, maybe some parenting books. I don't know exactly where my head's pulling this from, but this idea, something called the funnel of freedom, as it comes to dealing with kids. If you've ever been around a toddler for any length of time, you'll know that the majority of your time is spent trying to prevent your toddler from killing themselves. They will do all kinds of stuff that they don't know is dangerous, but you're well aware of that fact. And so what you do is you exert an incredible amount of control over that toddler when they are young, and then presumably as they get older and they age and they mature, they earn the right to more freedom. You see in them that they are disciplined, that they can take care of themselves, and you don't have to be on top of them as much. You don't have to control those as much. You can start opening up that funnel, and that allows them to leave childhood and become adults. And that's sort of the general premise there. So the idea, when you self-discipline, that begets freedom, naturally speaking. Therefore, as we consider liberty, we can begin to correctly understand that if we wish to have liberty with minimal interference from the government, preferably none at all, we can only hope to do so if our fellow man believes in us to act responsibly with the liberty we wish to exercise. So, going back to the parenting example, there are no parents, or there kind of are no parents for us as adults acting in society. There's only our fellow man. And what we need to do is our fellow man, again, this doesn't work perfectly every single time, but the idea is that if we can demonstrate sort of responsibility in public life, our fellow man feels comfortable not regulating that, right? So let me ask you, I'll put it to you like this. When you consider the idea of like some people out in the country who don't even lock their doors when they leave, why can they do that? Because the culture they live in is so stinking homogenized and so crime-free, they don't worry about it. People don't show up to their door. And if they happen to come over that way, the police are there or whomever else to help deal with that stuff. They're going to be there relatively quickly. So when we act with discipline within our own society, we need to somehow demonstrate that to people around us. And the best way that we can do that is through a shared culture. Now, famously, and many of you I'm sure have heard this quote before, John Adams once stated that our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. That's from John Adams to Massachusetts Militia, the 11th of October, 1798. So, while I'm at it, much hay has been made over the supposed deistic beliefs of our founders. And while it's certainly true that some individuals like Thomas Jefferson definitely were more deistic as opposed to what you might call regular old Christian, there's no doubt that our founders were Christian individuals. That said, the founding fathers, obviously, and certainly me, we're not advocating for some sort of Christian nationalist state. I'm a devout Christian individual. I'm going to vote people into power who represent my values. However, I don't know that this idea of you don't have to be Christian is what I'm getting at. I think that Christian and Muslim and the Jewish man and the agnostic and the atheist, all these individuals, and whatever other religion you happen to be, we can all get along just fine here in America, here in this society, provided one critical thing, and that is that shared culture. And a big part of that shared culture, and the reason I bring up the religion aspect, is the fact that the Western moral tradition, the moral tradition in which America is founded upon, the whole West, is decidedly Judeo-Christian. Easy examples of that, if you like the idea of innocent until proven guilty, that's from Blackstone's formulation, which I believe he was an Englishman, who then got it in turn from reasoning from the story of the Bible. And I believe I mentioned that in another topic. But it's the idea that you are innocent and proved guilty. It goes all the way back to Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible. And there are many instances where this is the case, where if you like the idea of being merciful, that you might want to step into the shoes of somebody else and understand, maybe this person, this person deserves this, but maybe it's a virtue, actually, to show them mercy, right? That wasn't always the case. In past lives and past history, the idea of being merciful was kind of an insult to a leader or a government. If someone was known as particularly merciful, that was shown as a sign of weakness. And then even beyond that, just the idea that we should not kill people who are pissing us off, for lack of a better term. That wasn't always the case. That wasn't always the case. In many parts of the world, might made right. That is a decidedly Judeo-Christian thing. And if it's not, and I recognize that some of you are like, well, actually, Dan, Actually, these things existed before Judeo-Christian moral tradition. True. Point to me the society in which those are the case currently, and point to me that same society which essentially has brought the current world into the modern era. For all the flaws of the modern West, there's no doubt that it is the modern West that has pulled the rest of the world into civilization as we know it, that's granted civilization all the boons that we presently have. That is the West, and that is the Western moral tradition, which is firmly founded on Judeo-Christian values. Now, like I said, I don't require the average person to be decidedly Christian or they can be whatever. But a respect must be given and an acknowledgement that culture is created from those elements only and not somewhere else. It would be great if all Americans became born-again, Bible-believing Christians. However, that remains an ongoing vision of the evangelical church and will likely never come to full fruition, even though it's one of those visions that the church is going to pursue, which is great, at least in my opinion, but you don't have to feel that way, which is wonderful also. What is quite possible is the recognition by Christian, by Muslim, by Jewish folks, all along with agnostics and atheists, that it is the Judeo-Christian heart of the Western moral tradition that birthed the American culture, and it is indeed a respect of that tradition by which we can communicate with one another and that we are worthy of liberty. And that gets us back to the original point. We need to have an ultimately shared culture. I don't necessarily need you to be the same religion as I am, although that would be great. You don't have to be. If you can ascribe to the Western moral tradition, we're going to be all right. And we can certainly get into Western moral tradition at a greater detail later, but for the time being, let's move on to what does realistic liberty or freedom look like. Let us turn to the ever-wise Thomas Paine. Quote, "Liberty is the power to do everything that does not interfere with the rights of others. Thus, the exercise of the natural rights of every individual has no limits, save those that assure to other members of society the enjoyment of the same rights." And that's Thomas Paine, Plan of a Declaration of Rights in 1792. Thomas Paine let us know that we have the freedom to do basically whatever we want, so long as it does not prevent others from doing basically what they want. And there is certainly a great deal of debate around what exactly that means. In essence, this is the non-aggression principle. Hopefully you guys are familiar with that one, which has been also summarized as follows. You effectively have the freedom to swing your fist as wildly as you please. However, that freedom ends where the next person's nose begins. Now, I hope that the astute reader can see, or excuse me, the astute listener in this case, can see how the usage of Thomas Paine's assessment of what is freedom has to go hand in hand with the belief that our fellow man is an inherently moral creature. After all, if I believe that my next door neighbor is an absolute heathen, I'm not going to afford that individual the rights to do as he or she pleases, because I firmly believe that individual is going to almost inevitably act to the detriment of my well-being. So that's where that shared culture comes into play. So our fellow man has to be an inherently moral creature. Otherwise, how are we to trust our fellow man who might be wildly swinging his metaphorical fists not to break our nose? It's all well and good to see punitive action after the fact, but I imagine most of us would simply rather not have our nose broken in the first place. And therefore, if we seek liberty with minimal or no interference from the government, the only way we keep the government out of our business is if our fellow man does not see a need to request the government to get in it. Which is tough. But ultimately, that is what makes up a nation. That's what makes up a nation state. Is if you have enough shared cultures where you're individual, the better that belief comes into play, that sort of homogenized belief system, the less you have to worry about the government getting involved. And before anybody jumps on the fact, by the way, I'm again not arguing for some sort of like white nationalist, purely whatever version of white I happen to be, state of America. Like I've said previously and will continue to state, being American is not tied to a race. It is tied to a belief system. You can be black, white, green, yellow, pink, blue, purple, green, or any other color, and from any other background. If you adhere to the Western moral tradition, we're good to go. So this isn't some sort of race-based nonsense, and hopefully I've also dispelled the Christian nationalist bent on this as well. I'm not shying away from my religion. And as far as my race, I don't really care what I am. It's just a fact of my birth. But what matters more to me is what rests in the heart of every man and what rests in my own heart as well. So, as an aside. So, like I say, we need to be able to trust our metaphorical neighbor to do right, culturally speaking. So, as another kind of aside to that, it certainly seems to me that many of our fellow men would be just fine to let one another alone. However, over the years, the government has grown to such a size that it has become a beast all its own, infringing upon the rights of Americans, liberal and conservative, for the aggrandizement of politicians, and their special interests. So this is me lashing out, if you will, against sort of the establishment left. And this is where I think there's a lot of ground for unity between the right and the left, which is to say that, look, if you're a liberal, I think you can recognize that the liberal establishment, the establishment politicians, are not your friends. Even if they say good things to you, even if they say good things to you, they're not your friends. Similarly, and again, us conservatives well know, even though Republicans say the things that we like to hear, they are not our friends either for the most part. There are only a handful, as far as I can tell, a handful of decent politicians on the left and the right, by the way, that exist in America, say, some of whom aren't even in power anymore. They're just kind of still public figures. At any rate, you may have the wisdom to question, why should I have to prove anything to my fellow man? Or you may ask, what if my fellow man is disinterested in respecting my right to liberty, even if we have sufficiently displayed the responsibility to have it? To answer that, let us return our attention to the previous example of a child and his parents. We have all seen examples of perfectly responsible, of a perfectly responsible child or teenager, as much as a child or teenager can be responsible, with incredibly overbearing parents. In like manner, it can be the case that our fellow man exceeds reason. In fact, this is the entire reason that the 13 colonies declared independence from the Great Britain originally. King George had become unreasonable in his governance of the colonies. So I'll leave it at that. In summary, liberty is the freedom to do as you ought. What we ought to do has wide boundaries, and you can see Thomas Paine's definition above for a brief overview of those boundaries yet again. If we are to ask our fellow men not to entreat the government to suppress our God-given rights to liberty, then we must display an appropriate level of responsibility and discipline so as to demonstrate our worthiness of his trust, within reason. The easiest way to communicate this worthiness is shared culture. Our founders envisioned a shared culture built upon the Western moral tradition, whose heart is Christianity. And again, you don't have to be Christian, merely respect where it came from. Thus, if we expect liberty, we must first act responsibly, understand our rights, our natural, God-given rights, demonstrate that responsibility within reason, and demand our right to liberty be respected. And that last part is pretty important. Like I said, I'm a conservative. Long has the Republican Party attempted to properly represent us conservatives in governance, and quite frankly, it's just not been the case. When the average conservative demands his or her right to be respected, it seems that our politicians, for the most part, they don't go to Washington to represent our interests. They instead go to Washington, get their marching orders, and they return to us and represent Washington to us. It's not, hey man, we want you to go to Washington and tell them what we want, and we're not taking anything less. No, they show up to Washington and come back to us and say, well, actually, guys, you don't understand. This is what we need to be doing here. No. Disinterested. At any rate, as for the concept of a shared culture, that is part and parcel of the mission of the Badass Patriot Company. Our hope is that the Badass Patriot Star, whether you wear it on a t-shirt, a hoodie, a hat, or some other thing, that we can create down the road that whenever you see that star, you share a kindred spirit with that individual. That is why we emphasize it's not about left and right necessarily. We believe, like again, as I've stated earlier, that the center and center-left individual has far more in common with me, a staunch conservative, than they do with the radical left, which is currently running their supposed party here in the United States. And so that's what we're trying to create. This, among many things, this star that you see on my hat here, a symbol that indicates, hey, look, man, we share a common ideology. And that is a spirit of patriotism for this great country and the principles upon which it was founded. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. If you're still a little iffy on it, we're going to go into duty a little bit later on. That'll be the next installment of the Badass Patriot Core Principles series. Be on the lookout for that. But do tune into that next time because, again, those two go hand in hand. Liberty and duty are intertwined. Because as I've stated, if we're going to show that we are responsible and do our part at least to show that we are responsible citizens, that goes hand in hand with the duty that we must exercise. Within reason, of course. So be on the lookout for that down the road. In the meantime, I thank you guys for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. If you haven't already, if you like this video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up there on Rumble. If you're watching it on YouTube, again, like, comment, and subscribe. And most importantly, no matter what platform you're on, please share the message. Share the message that there is more in common between you and me, whether we're left, right, and center, than we have with the radical left, which is kind of running things. The radical left or even the radical establishment, if you're on the conservative side. We have more in common together as just normal Americans, whether we are, liberal or conservative. We have far more in common than what our politicians and what our media would have us believe. And I believe this country is the greatest country to have ever existed and to presently exist despite its many, many flaws. And that is because its people are inherently good. And I believe that about us, and I believe that not only can that be that is true presently, but it can be reinculcated to a more, to form a more perfect union, as it were. So thanks, guys. Again, I am Dan Weichart, VP and co-founder of the Badass Patriot Company, and I thank you for being around. We'll see you next time.